So our next examples are actually here. Find the inverse function of f, and they give us these two functions f, which are really similar. But before we do that, let's look at this picture. The graph of f of x equals x minus 4 all squared is this picture. This is not a one-to-one function, right? Okay, so look down here. We have the same function, x minus 4 all squared, but we're restricting the domain to x is greater than or equal to 4. So greater than or equal to 4 means in the positive direction. We're starting here. We're going to the right. We're only looking at this side of our graph. In other words, we're looking at this picture. Okay, and the second example is the same function, but we're restricting our domain to x is less than or equal to 4. So we're looking at this side of our graph, or this picture. Okay, so let's find this inverse function. This is our y, so we switch x and y, and we solve for y. Well, to solve for y, I need to take the square root of both sides, which means I need to do a plus or minus, right? Don't forget plus or minus when you take the square root of both sides. Okay, the square root and the square cancel, leaving us with y minus 4. Now we add 4 to both sides, and I get y is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of x. In other words, f inverse of x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of x. I have to figure out if I'm talking about the plus side or the minus side, because I cannot have two different outcomes, right? So, well, which one am I looking at? Let's look back up here at this problem. The domain, remember domain means all of the x values. The domain of this function is from 4 to infinity, which matches this restriction. Domain is 4 to infinity. Well, what's the range? The range starts at 0 and goes up, right? So the range is 0 to infinity. So whenever you switch your x and y and solve for y, in your inverse function, the range becomes the domain. So this range becomes this domain, and this domain becomes this range. Well, how is that going to help us? First of all, it's just good information to know, okay? But it will also help us in determining if we need the plus side or the minus side. The 4 to infinity means we're looking at the positive side of our function, right? If we were to reflect this graph over the line y equals x, this is actually drawn in this grid, you just can't see it, it's very light. You would get this picture as your inverse function, right? This is the graph of the square root function shifted up 4 units. Doesn't that mean it's the square root of x plus 4? There are many different ways to go about getting this, but this is going to be one of those many ways. Okay, let's find the inverse going the other direction. Well, we know whenever we switch x and y, we get the same thing as we got on this side. So I'm going to just skip down to that last step. We still get 4 plus or minus the square root of x is equal to y. So the inverse function is equal to 4 something square root of x. Well, this time, the domain of the original function was less than or equal to 4. So negative infinity to 4, including the 4. And what was the range of this original function? the range starts at 0 and still goes to infinity, right? Starts at 0, goes forever up. So when we get down here to our inverse function, the domain becomes the range of the original, and the range becomes the domain of the original. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, we know we're reflecting this graph, this blue graph, over the line y equals x. We are reflecting this graph over this line. Isn't this the point 4, 0? When you switch x and y, don't you get the point 0, 4? So we get that point right there. There's so many ways you could attack one of these type of problems. Whenever you reflect the original function over the line y equals x, you end up with this picture. If you remember your toolkit functions, this is the negative absolute value function. Remember we talked about if you have the square root of x, it makes that general shape right there, the square root of x. Since we add 4 to it, it shifts it up 4 units. Well, on this one, it's flipped upside down, which means it's a negative, but it's also shifted up 4 units, which means it's plus 4, right? So that just means we have 4 minus the square root of x. This is our inverse function.